James Thompson stepped off the transport shuttle and immediately felt the artificial gravity pull at his legs in an unfamiliar way. The space station's corridors stretched endlessly in both directions, filled with the soft hum of air recyclers and the gentle blue glow of safety lights. Everything was clean, sterile, and perfectly controlled. Nothing like the chaotic mess of Earth's atmosphere. He adjusted the small breathing device clipped to his collar, though he barely needed it. The station's air was actually richer in oxygen than what he was used to back home in Montana. Still, the academy required all students to wear the safety equipment during their first month. Rules were rules. "Human student, please report to Classroom 7 Alpha," announced a mechanical voice from hidden speakers. James picked up his single bag and started walking, following the glowing arrows embedded in the floor. The other students stared at him as he walked past. Some whispered to each other in languages that sounded like singing crystals or rushing wind. James had studied basic Galactic Common, but the conversations moved too quickly for him to follow. A group of tall, crystalline beings stood near one wall, their bodies catching and reflecting the corridor lights like living prisms. They looked beautiful, almost like walking gemstones. These had to be the Christek that his orientation materials had mentioned. Their movements were slow and graceful, and they seemed to communicate by changing colors within their transparent bodies. Further down the hall, James saw what looked like contained clouds of gas floating in clear environmental suits. The Nethian students moved by somehow pushing themselves through the air, their gaseous forms swirling and shifting inside their protective gear. Occasionally, colored patterns would flash through their containment suits, probably their version of facial expressions. The strangest sight was a group of six-limbed creatures that looked like a cross between spiders and crabs, but the size of large dogs. Their multiple arms moved independently as they manipulated several data tablets at once. These were the Kethrani, and their compound eyes followed James's movement as he passed their group. None of them approached him. James wondered if they were scared, curious, or just being polite. He had read that humans were relatively new to the galactic community, and that most species found Earth's conditions to be impossibly dangerous. The orientation packet had mentioned that humans were classified as Deathworlders, though James still did not understand what that meant exactly. Classroom 7 Alpha was larger than any lecture hall James had seen on Earth. The ceiling stretched up at least 30 feet, and the room was designed to accommodate wildly different types of students. Some seats were filled with special atmospheric equipment for the gas-based Nethians. Others had been modified with heating elements for species that needed warmer temperatures. A few areas had been set up with what looked like charging stations. James found a normal-looking chair in the back row and sat down, pulling out his basic tablet computer. Around him, other students were setting up equipment that looked far more advanced than anything he had brought. Some had holographic displays that projected three-dimensional images into the air. Others worked with devices that seemed to respond to thought commands rather than physical touch. "Welcome, students, to Advanced Ecosystem Design," said a voice that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. At the front of the room, a tall Christek professor had entered, her crystalline body shifting through shades of blue and green as she spoke. "I am Professor Veltara, and this semester we will explore the fundamental principles of creating sustainable living environments for galactic colonization." The professor's body brightened, and suddenly a massive holographic display filled the center of the room. It showed a rotating planet with green and blue swirls across its surface. "Today, we begin with basic population dynamics. Your assignment is to calculate optimal colonist numbers for theoretical world Gamma 7. Data began scrolling through the air around the projected planet. James squinted at the numbers, trying to read the galactic standard measurements. Temperature range, -10 to 40 degrees Celsius. Seasonal weather patterns including precipitation and wind. Seismic activity rated at level 2. Standard oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere composition. Gravity at 0.9 Earth standard. This is considered an intermediate difficulty assignment, Professor Veltara continued, her body now glowing a warm yellow color. You will need to account for all environmental hazards, apply proper galactic safety protocols, and design infrastructure to protect colonists from the planet's dangerous conditions. Please work in groups and submit your calculations by the end of next week. James looked around as students immediately began forming study groups. The Christek students clustered together, their bodies flashing in rapid color patterns that seemed to be some form of high-speed communication. The Kethrani formed their own group, their multiple arms already pulling up complex calculation programs on their devices. Even the Nethians had somehow managed to link their environmental suits together to share data processing power. James raised his hand. "Professor, can we work individually?" The classroom fell silent. Every student turned to stare at him, and Professor Veltara's crystal form flickered through several confused colors before settling on a deep purple. Individual work on ecosystem design is not recommended for safety reasons, she replied carefully. The calculations are quite complex, and errors could result in theoretical colony failure. I understand, James said. But I'd like to try it alone first, if that's okay. Professor Veltara's colors shifted again, cycling through what James guessed were the Christek equivalent of surprise and concern. Very well. But please consult with classmates if you encounter difficulties. James nodded and looked back at the planetary data. He pulled out his simple calculator and started making notes on paper. Around him, the study groups were already deep in discussion about atmospheric dome construction, underground shelter systems, and emergency evacuation procedures. The numbers looked familiar to James. The temperature range was actually narrower than what he experienced during a typical year in Montana. The seismic activity rating seemed pretty low compared to places like California where millions of people lived normal lives. The gravity was close enough to Earth normal that it would not cause any problems. James started with basic population density calculations that he remembered from his high school geography class. Urban areas, suburban zones, agricultural land, fresh water access, natural resources. He factored in seasonal weather patterns and the relatively mild seismic activity. Within about 30 minutes, he had finished his calculations and double-checked his math. His final number, 2.4 billion colonists, living directly on the planet's surface with minimal protective infrastructure. He looked around at the study groups, who were still in the early stages of discussing basic safety requirements. James wondered if he had missed something important in the assignment, but the math seemed straightforward. The following week, Classroom 7 Alpha buzzed with nervous energy as students prepared their presentations. James sat in his usual spot in the back row, watching his classmates set up elaborate holographic displays and connect multiple data processing units. His own presentation consisted of 3 handwritten pages and a simple digital slideshow on his basic tablet. Professor Veltara entered the room, her crystalline form shifting through calm blue and green colors. Today we will review your population calculations for Gamma 7. Please remember that this exercise tests your understanding of basic safety protocols and sustainable colonization principles. The first presentation came from a group of Christek students led by a tall, angular being named Mordain. Their holographic display showed a beautiful domed city rising from the planet's surface like a giant bubble. Inside the dome, carefully controlled gardens and residential areas housed exactly 50,000 colonists. Our design prioritizes safety above all else, Mordain explained, his crystal body flashing with confident yellow light. The atmospheric dome protects residents from dangerous temperature fluctuations and unpredictable weather patterns. Underground bunkers provide emergency shelter during seismic events. Food production occurs in controlled hydroponic facilities that cannot be damaged by external conditions. The Christek group detailed their backup systems, emergency protocols, and redundant safety measures. Their presentation took 20 minutes and included detailed engineering schematics for air filtration systems, temperature regulators, and structural supports designed to withstand the planet's extreme conditions. Professor Veltara's form brightened with approval. Excellent work. Your safety margins are appropriate for the challenging environment. Next came the Kethrony group, led by a student named Zixtal whose 6 arms moved in perfect coordination as she operated multiple display screens simultaneously. Their design featured underground cities connected by tunnels, housing 30,000 colonists in carefully climate-controlled chambers. Surface conditions are too unpredictable for permanent habitation, Zixtal explained, her compound eyes reflecting the light from her displays. Our subterranean approach eliminates exposure to temperature variations, weather systems, and seismic activity. Geothermal energy provides power while protecting colonists from surface dangers. The Kethrony presentation included escape routes, emergency supplies, and detailed maps showing how colonists could survive underground for years if surface conditions became too dangerous. Their safety calculations assumed that any exposure to the planet's natural environment could be potentially fatal. The Nethian group floated their environmental suits closer to the presentation area. Their spokesperson, a swirling purple gas cloud named Vexhai, communicated through a translation device that converted their chemical signals into audible speech. We propose orbital habitats connected to the planet by transport shuttles, the device announced as Vexhai's colors shifted through rapid patterns. Direct planetary settlement is inadvisable given the extreme environmental hazards. Our space-based colonies can house 25,000 beings in complete safety, with surface operations conducted only by automated systems. Each presentation followed the same pattern: elaborate protective systems, minimal population numbers, and extensive safety protocols to protect colonists from what every group considered a hostile and dangerous world. Finally, Professor Veltara called James to present. The room fell quiet as he walked to the front, carrying only his tablet and handwritten notes. The other students watched with obvious curiosity as he connected his simple device to the classroom's display system. "My calculation shows 2.4 billion colonists," James announced, and immediately the room erupted in surprised chatter. Multiple students made sounds that James assumed were expressions of shock or disbelief. Professor Veltara's crystalline form flickered rapidly between colors before settling on a deep, concerned purple. "Student James, please verify your numbers. This appears to be a significant computational error." "I checked the math twice," James replied, pulling up his simple slideshow. "The planet's conditions are actually pretty mild. Temperature swings of 50 degrees, low seismic activity, and a breathable atmosphere. It reminds me of Colorado, where I grew up." The Christech students were flashing rapid warning colors to each other. The Kethrani group had pulled their limbs close to their bodies in what James recognized as a defensive posture. Even the Nethians had compressed their gaseous forms into tight, worried balls within their environmental suits. "You propose surface dwelling?" asked Mordain, his crystal body now pulsing with alarmed red light. "Without atmospheric protection?" "Sure," James said, advancing to his next slide. "I calculated standard urban density for cities, suburban areas, and rural zones. The climate supports normal agriculture, so food production should not be a problem. The seismic activity is rated level 2, which is pretty low. I've lived in areas with much higher earthquake risk." "What about the temperature extremes?" Zixtal asked, her compound eyes wide with apparent horror. 50-degree temperature range is normal for most places on Earth, James explained. Humans regularly live in areas with 70 or even 80-degree annual temperature variations. My hometown in Montana gets cold enough to freeze water solid in winter and hot enough to dry out lakes in summer. People just dress appropriately and adjust their activities." The room had gone completely silent. James looked around at the staring faces and floating gas clouds, wondering if he had misunderstood something fundamental about the assignment. "Student James," Professor Veltara said carefully, her voice carrying harmonic undertones that sounded worried, "your calculations assume that colonists can survive direct exposure to planetary conditions without protective infrastructure." "Well, yes," James replied. "I mean, they would need basic shelter from rain and snow, and houses with heating and cooling systems. But nothing too complicated. Just normal buildings like anywhere else." Professor Veltara's crystal form had begun to darken, cycling through colors that James had never seen before. Around the room, students were making what sounded like distressed noises in their various languages. "Please remain after class," the professor said quietly. "I believe we need to discuss your methodology in greater detail." James nodded and returned to his seat, still confused by everyone's reaction. The assignment had seemed straightforward enough. As other students packed up their elaborate equipment, he noticed them stealing nervous glances in his direction and whispering to each other in concerned tones. He wondered what he had gotten wrong. After the other students had left, James approached Professor Veltara's desk. The crystalline being had dimmed to a deep, worried blue color that reminded James of storm clouds. Her usually graceful movements seemed stiff and uncertain as she organized her teaching materials. "Please sit down, Student James," she said, gesturing to a chair beside her desk. Her voice carried those musical undertones that James was beginning to recognize as signs of distress. "I need you to explain your calculations step by step." James pulled out his handwritten notes and placed them on the desk. The simple pages looked almost primitive next to the professor's advanced holographic displays and crystal data storage devices. "I started with basic population density models," he began. "Urban areas can typically support about 10,000 people per square kilometer if you plan the infrastructure correctly." Professor Veltara's form flickered with confused colors. "But what about atmospheric protection? Temperature regulation systems? Emergency bunkers for seismic events?" "Well, people would live in regular buildings with heating and air conditioning," James replied. "And the seismic activity is only level 2. That's really not dangerous enough to require special bunkers. Level 2 seismic activity has destroyed entire Christech settlements," Professor Veltara said quietly. "Our homeworld experiences level 0.5 activity, and even that requires extensive structural reinforcement." James blinked in surprise. Really? Level 2 is like minor earthquakes that you barely notice. My college dorm in California was built on a fault line with level 6 activity. Students would joke about homework assignments getting easier during earthquake season because the shaking would knock things off desks. The professor's crystalline body went completely dark for several seconds. When light returned, it was a pale, shocked white. Students would joke about seismic disasters. They were not disasters, James explained. Just part of life. You learn to secure your bookshelves and keep emergency supplies handy. Most buildings are designed to handle much stronger shaking than level 6. Professor Veltara was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. What about the temperature variations? 50 degrees Celsius difference between seasons would sterilize most known biospheres. 50 degrees is actually pretty moderate, James said. My hometown in Montana regularly sees 90-degree temperature swings. Winter temperatures drop to -30 Celsius, and summer can reach 60 degrees. People adapt. We wear heavier clothes in winter and lighter clothes in summer. Houses have good insulation and heating systems. -30 degrees. The professor's voice had risen to a higher, more alarmed harmonic frequency. That temperature would freeze the biological fluids of most galactic species solid within minutes. James nodded. Yeah, it's cold. But humans have lived in those conditions for thousands of years. Inuit peoples traditionally lived in much colder climates with just basic technology. Modern heating systems make it pretty comfortable. Professor Veltara stood up abruptly, her crystalline form cycling through rapid color changes that James could not interpret. She moved to her computer terminal and began typing with quick, precise movements. Student James, I want to try a different calculation, she said. What if you used your homeworld as the model planet? What population could Earth support? James hesitated. Are you sure? Earth is a bit more challenging than Gamma 7. Please proceed. James pulled out his calculator and started working with new numbers. Earth has temperature ranges from -40 to +55 Celsius, depending on location. We have Category 5 hurricanes with wind speeds over 250 km per hour. Seismic activity ranges up to level 9. Active volcanoes. Tornadoes. Tsunamis. Desert regions with no surface water. Arctic zones with 6 months of darkness. With each new piece of information, Professor Veltara's crystalline form grew dimmer. By the time James mentioned venomous creatures and large predators, her light had faded to barely visible. And humans live directly on this planet's surface, she asked weakly. Over 7 billion of us, James confirmed. We build cities in hurricane paths, earthquake zones, and active volcanic regions. Los Angeles sits on major fault lines. Miami gets hit by hurricanes every few years. People in tornado country just build storm shelters and carry on with their lives. James finished his calculations and looked at the result. Earth could theoretically support about 4 to 7 billion humans with current technology and resource management. Professor Veltara's light went out completely. James waited nervously, wondering if he had somehow broken the alien professor. After several seconds, a very faint glow returned to her crystalline structure. 4 to 7 billion, she repeated in a whisper. Living on the surface of a world with level 9 seismic activity and category 5 atmospheric disturbances. Well, not everyone lives in the most dangerous areas, James said helpfully. Some places are pretty safe. Like the Midwest, where the worst thing you usually deal with is tornadoes, blizzards, and occasional flooding. The professor made a sound like breaking glass that James suspected was the Christek equivalent of a nervous breakdown. Professor, are you okay? James asked with genuine concern. I need to contact my colleagues, Professor Veltara said, her voice barely audible. This changes everything we thought we knew about habitability parameters. She turned to face James directly, her form now a deep, serious purple. Student James, you have just informed me that your species routinely inhabits environments that our most advanced survival technology could not protect us in for more than a few hours. James shrugged. I guess humans are pretty adaptable. We've had to be. Earth is not exactly the most peaceful planet in the galaxy. Professor Veltara stared at him for a long moment, her crystalline structure cycling through colors that seemed to indicate deep thought mixed with growing alarm. No, she said quietly. I am beginning to suspect that Earth may be one of the most hostile worlds any known species has ever encountered. And you evolved there naturally. James was beginning to understand why his classmates had reacted so strongly to his presentation. Is that bad? The professor's response was another sound like breaking crystal that James was learning to recognize as Christek laughter, though it seemed to contain more hysteria than humor. Within 3 days, word of James's calculations had spread throughout the entire academic station. Students whispered about the impossible numbers in the corridors. Faculty members held urgent meetings behind closed doors. The station's communication systems buzzed with messages being sent to universities across the galaxy. James noticed the change immediately. Other students would stop talking when he walked past. Some stared at him with what looked like fear, while others seemed fascinated. A few brave Kethrani students had started following him at a distance, taking notes on everything he did. Even simple activities like eating lunch or walking to class seemed to interest them greatly. On Thursday morning, James received a message on his tablet asking him to report to the Grand Assembly Hall. He had never been to that part of the station before. The corridors leading there were wider and more formal, with expensive-looking decorations and important-sounding plaques on the walls. The Grand Assembly Hall was enormous. The ceiling stretched up at least 50 feet, and the room could easily hold 1,000 beings. Today, it was filled with the station's entire faculty. Christek professors created a rainbow of nervous colors along one wall. Nethian academics floated in their environmental suits, their gaseous forms swirling with agitation. Kethrani faculty members clustered in small groups, their multiple arms gesturing rapidly as they spoke in low voices. At the front of the room, a massive holographic display showed Gamma 7 rotating slowly in space. Beneath it, numbers and calculations scrolled through the air in multiple languages and measurement systems. Professor Veltara stood near the display, her crystalline form now a steady, determined blue color. Beside her was Dr. Morthek, the station's leading expert on planetary habitability. James had seen him before but never met him personally. The Nethian professor's gaseous form was compressed into a tight, angry-looking ball within his containment suit. "Student James," Dr. Morthek announced as James entered the hall, his translated voice carrying tones of challenge and disbelief. "Please take the presentation platform. We wish to review your calculations with the full faculty." James walked to the front of the room, feeling hundreds of alien eyes watching his every step. He connected his simple tablet to the hall's advanced display system, and his handwritten calculations appeared as giant holographic images floating in the air. "Dr. Morthek has suggested that your numbers contain fundamental errors," Professor Veltara explained. "He believes no species could survive the conditions you describe as normal living environments." Dr. Morthek's gaseous form swelled more aggressively. "These population figures represent biological impossibilities. No intelligent life could develop under such extreme conditions, much less thrive in numbers reaching billions." James looked out at the assembled faculty. "I'm just using standard human baseline conditions. Earth isn't even considered particularly dangerous by our standards." "Prove it," Dr. Morthek demanded. James activated his presentation and began showing images from Earth. The first photograph showed New York City at night, with millions of lights stretching to the horizon. "This is New York. About 8 million humans live here in close proximity. The buildings you see are constructed without environmental domes or atmospheric protection." Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the audience. Several Christek professors were flashing rapid warning colors to each other. The next image showed Mexico City. 21 million humans live here at high altitude in an active volcanic zone. They built the city directly on top of ancient lake beds, which makes earthquake damage worse. People still choose to live there. A Kethrani professor in the third row made a clicking sound that James had learned indicated extreme distress. "You show us disaster sites." "No, these are normal cities where people live regular lives," James replied. "This is San Francisco, built directly on major earthquake fault lines. This is Miami, which gets hit by massive hurricanes every few years. This is Phoenix, where summer temperatures regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius, and people still play sports outside." Dr. Morthek's containment suit was vibrating with agitation. "What about predators? Surely no intelligent species would coexist with dangerous fauna." James smiled and pulled up new images. "These are safari tours in Africa, where humans pay money to get close to large predators. This animal weighs about 4 tons and could easily kill a human, but people camp near them for fun. This is a great white shark. Humans swim in oceans where these live, sometimes deliberately trying to see them up close." The hall erupted in sounds of panic. Christek professors were flashing emergency colors, Nethians were compressing themselves into defensive positions, and several Kethrani faculty members had actually retreated toward the exits. "For recreation," James continued, Humans climb mountains where the atmosphere is too thin to breathe properly. They jump out of aircraft for entertainment. They dive deep underwater where pressure would crush most galactic species. They explore caves that could collapse at any moment. Professor Veltara had managed to maintain her composure, but her crystalline form was cycling through colors James had never seen before. Student James, what you describe sounds like deliberate self-endangerment behaviors. We call it living, James replied. Humans need some excitement and challenge to be happy. A completely safe environment would be boring. The word boring seemed to hit the assembled faculty like a physical blow. Dr. Morthek's gaseous form had compressed into the smallest ball James had ever seen, and his translation device was making sounds that might have been electronic sobbing. There are places on Earth, James continued, where humans live that make Gamma 7 look like a vacation resort. The Sahara Desert, where temperatures reach 60 degrees and there's no surface water for hundreds of kilometers. Northern Alaska, where winter temperatures drop below -50 degrees and the sun doesn't rise for months. Tornado Alley, where massive atmospheric storms destroy entire towns, and people rebuild in the same spots the next year. A senior Christech professor near the front row had gone completely transparent, which James suspected was their equivalent of fainting. The most dangerous thing about Gamma 7, James concluded, is that it might be too safe for humans to find interesting. The Grand Assembly Hall fell into complete silence. James looked out at hundreds of alien faces frozen in expressions of shock, terror, and disbelief. He wondered if he had said something wrong. Finally, Professor Veltara found her voice. The faculty needs time to process this information. Thank you, Student James. As James left the hall, he could hear the sounds of academic panic erupting behind him. 3 months later, James walked through corridors that had completely transformed. Where once the walls displayed standard galactic safety protocols, new signs now warned about Deathworlder consultation required and human risk assessment needed. The academic station buzzed with activity as professors from across the galaxy arrived to study what they were calling the most significant breakthrough in habitability science in over 1,000 years. James still did not fully understand what all the fuss was about. His simple homework assignment had somehow turned into the foundation for an entirely new field of study. The station's library now had an entire section dedicated to extreme environment adaptation theory, and most of the books featured his calculations prominently in their opening chapters. Professor Veltara had been promoted to head a new department called Deathworld Studies. Her crystalline form had returned to healthy, bright colors, though she still flickered nervously whenever James entered her classroom. She had also started wearing what looked like a small protective charm around her neck, which James suspected was some kind of good luck symbol. Today we will review the revised galactic habitability classifications, Professor Veltara announced to her advanced colonization theory class. The room was packed beyond capacity, with students from every department crowding in to hear the latest updates. The holographic display showed a familiar image of Gamma 7, but now it was labeled with bright green text reading Class H habitable, human consultation available. Below it scrolled a list of planets that had been reclassified from uninhabitable death trap to challenging but viable with human advisory support. Kepler 442b, previously considered impossible to colonize due to extreme temperature variations, has been approved for settlement with human consultation, the professor continued. Initial survey teams will include human advisors to assess actual risk levels. James raised his hand. What made them change their minds about these planets? Professor Veltara's form brightened with what James had learned to recognize as pride mixed with residual terror. Your homework assignment, Student James. The Galactic Council realized that their safety standards were based entirely on the biological limitations of species from much gentler worlds than Earth. A Kethrani student named Zixtal, who had become one of James's regular study partners, clicked her approval. The old classifications assumed that any world with temperature variations above 20 degrees was uninhabitable. Now we know that such worlds simply require Deathworlder expertise. The economic implications are staggering, added Mordain, the Christech student whose original presentation had featured elaborate dome cities. Planets we dismissed as worthless are now prime real estate. The Centauri Mining Consortium has requested human advisors for 17 different worlds. James pulled out his tablet to check his latest assignment. Professor Veltara had given him what she called a simple ecosystem management problem, involving a planet with dangerous predators. The assignment notes mentioned that the apex predator weighed approximately 60 kilograms and possessed fearsome hunting instincts. Professor, about this new assignment, James said, showing his tablet screen. The predator you describe sounds pretty manageable. 60 kilos is only about the size of a large dog. The classroom fell silent. Zixtal's compound eyes widened in what James now recognized as horror, and several students made distressed noises in their various languages. Large, dog. Professor Veltara's voice carried those high harmonic frequencies that indicated extreme concern. Yeah, back on Earth we keep animals that size as pets. My family had a German Shepherd that weighed about 70 kilos. Kids would play with him in the backyard. James scrolled through the assignment details. Actually, this predator seems kind of small compared to what humans are used to dealing with. Dr. Morthek, who had started attending James's classes as part of his research into human psychology, made his characteristic electronic sobbing sound. You keep predators as companions. Well, they're domesticated, James explained. But humans have also learned to coexist with much larger wild predators. Bears can weigh up to 800 kilograms. Tigers, lions, wolves, crocodiles. We've developed methods for living safely in areas where these animals hunt. Mordane's crystalline form had turned a deep red color that indicated panic. Methods for coexisting with 800-kilogram predators. Sure. Proper food storage, awareness of animal behavior, basic safety precautions. Some humans actually seek out encounters with large predators for recreational purposes. There's this thing called wildlife photography where people deliberately get close to dangerous animals to take pictures. Professor Veltara had started making that breaking glass sound that James recognized as nervous laughter. Student James, what Earth creatures would you consider actually dangerous? James thought for a moment. Well, there are some animals you definitely want to avoid. Saltwater crocodiles, polar bears, blue-ringed octopi, box jellyfish, various snakes, and spiders. But even then, millions of humans live in areas where these creatures exist. You just learn to be careful and take appropriate precautions. Box jellyfish, squeaked a small voice from the back of the room. Tiny ocean creature, almost transparent, incredibly venomous, James explained helpfully. Australians swim in waters where they live. They just wear protective suits and watch for warning signs. Dr. Morthek had compressed himself into the smallest ball James had ever seen. Australians voluntarily enter waters containing nearly invisible venomous creatures. Australians are pretty tough, James agreed. They live on a continent with some of Earth's most dangerous wildlife. Spiders, snakes, crocodiles, sharks, deadly jellyfish, venomous cone snails, blue-ringed octopi, cassowary birds that can kill you with their claws. Australians consider it home. Professor Veltara quietly began drafting another revision to the Galactic Habitability Standards. She had a growing suspicion that what humans considered manageable risk would require entirely new safety categories. James finished reviewing his assignment and packed up his materials. As he left the classroom, he overheard Professor Veltara speaking quietly to Dr. Morthek. Note to research file, she was saying. Never ask the human what he considers difficult. Our current understanding of extreme conditions appears to be what humans classify as pleasant weather for outdoor activities. James walked back to his dormitory, already planning his approach to the ecosystem management problem. The predator described in the assignment seemed so small and manageable that he wondered if this was another one of those trick questions designed to test whether students would overcomplicate simple problems. He had no idea that his casual dismissal of 60-kilogram predators as manageable would lead to yet another complete revision of galactic safety protocols, or that his upcoming presentation would establish humans as the galaxy's premier experts on impossible colonization challenges. After all, it was just homework.